So, following a long stretch of one party rule, which was by the Democratic Republicans, the period between 1828 and 1850 in American history is going to see a lot of development in the country's political, economic, and social conditions. President Andrew Jackson is going to set the tone for this era, which is why we call it the Jacksonian Era, at what we begin with. This self-professed representative of the common man is going to seek to keep the country true to its agrarian roots by limiting the role of the federal government. And though he actually departed from this philosophy in ways that are unacceptable to both his opponents and to his allies, dissatisfaction with Jackson's policies are going to lead to the formation of a new political party called the Whigs. And they're going to unite in opposition to the policies of so-called Jacksonian Democracy. So the rapid industrialization is going to require improvements to our country's infrastructure, such as a network of railroad lines that's going to make transportation more efficient. Economic growth is going to help draw millions of European immigrants who found an opportunity, as well as Americans who are resentful of their presence of being here. And Americans are also going to experience their first economic depression. Settlement of the West is going to greatly accelerate as the U.S. acquires vast territory through treaties and wars that we're going to get into. And this feeling of manifest destiny that the Americans use to justify expansion also condemns Native Americans to relocation by the federal government to designated areas, if not outright war and slaughter of those peoples. So a host of social movements are also going to emerge during this time. And they come out of that second great awakening, and they're going to lead people to realize that they can organize and they can speak out against issues that are detrimental to their visions of what society should look like. And their support for these causes, such as abolition of slavery, are going to increase in the North. And though conflict over this issue and other issues that we're going to discuss are later going to lead to the Civil War, they're going to fester and they're going to further divide the country along economic and geographical lines. Some of the essential questions. Now, we're going to split this particular PowerPoint series into several different projects, actually. The first part of it we're going to call the Jacksonian Era, and we're going to get into the age of Jackson. We're going to look at what Jackson did and what he specifically did for our government and how we see trends of that still today. And we'll draw some parallels between Jackson and Jefferson. But we'll continue into industrialization and reform. We'll move into sectionalism and then into Civil War and Reconstruction. I left out manifest destiny there. When we talk about the sectionalism that is created in the United States, we'll talk about how manifest destiny drives that. And then we'll get into Civil War and Reconstruction. So the essential questions. What challenges did the nation face between 1828 and 1850? In what ways did the two-party system and partisan politics both help and hinder the government's ability to address the nation's problems? How did the governmental leaders and policies affect Native Americans during this time period? In what ways did the country evolve and grow between 1828 and 1850? How did the social movements during this period work against the status quo? And we're going to look at those as we go. The first thing we're going to look at is Andrew Jackson. So Andrew Jackson was born in 1767 near the border of North Carolina and South Carolina. Although we don't know exactly where he was born, we know it was somewhere in that area. He became accustomed to military life at a very early age. And during the Revolutionary War, he's going to serve as a courier and become a British prisoner of war at the age of 13. Andrew and his brother Robert are going to become ill with smallpox, and they're going to almost starve to death when they're in British captivity. His brother Robert will die shortly after their release. And so Andrew Jackson carries around this hatred for the British. And it intensifies when a British soldier who's angry that young Andrew Jackson has refused to clean his boots is going to slash him with a sword. It's going to scar his head and his left hand. Both Jackson's parents die in the war, and which leaves Jackson an orphan after the war at the age of 14. And Jackson's early career is going to include stints working for a saddle maker, teaching school. You can imagine Andrew Jackson being your teacher. And he then is going to study law and move to Western North Carolina, which is now what we call Tennessee, to work as a lawyer. He's going to prosper as a frontier attorney, focusing on land claim disputes and violent crime, which is going to plague that frontier region. When Tennessee gained statehood in 1796, Jackson becomes its representative of Congress. He won a seat in the Senate in 1797, and he serves in the Democratic Republican Party, which I think we already kind of established that. But he is going to resign within a year. And then he serves on the Tennessee Supreme Court from 1798 to 1804. While practicing law and engaging in politics, Jackson also is going to have some success as a cotton farmer. And as a cotton farmer, he relies on slaves to work his plantation, the Hermitage, and he also owns a general store. When we look at the life and the career of Andrew Jackson, so during the War of 1812 is when we really see Andrew Jackson come forward, even though he did partake in the American Revolution as a young teenager. He's going to command the Tennessee militia against the Creek Indians, and he's hoping to open Native American lands to white settlement. And he led approximately 2,000 men in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, killing approximately 800 Red Stick men in a 5-hour battle. And the Creeks' defeat is going to force them to cede half of Alabama and parts of Georgia to the United States. So he's successful. And after he defeats the Creeks, he's going to march his troops down to New Orleans to defend the U.S. against the British. And his toughness there is going to earn him the name Old Hickory. He'll carry this name with him for the rest of his career. And this means he's as tough as an old hickory tree or this type of old hardwood. Jackson's 5,000 troops defeat the 7,500 British troops at the Battle of New Orleans on January 8, 1815. And we know that this was the final battle of the War of 1812. But neither party knew that we had already signed the Treaty of Ghent in Belgium in 1814 because, again, we didn't have a cell phone that we could pick up and call and say, hey, the war's ended. So we had to wait for that to travel across the Atlantic Ocean and then word to get down to New Orleans. So we fight this battle after the war is over. In 1817, President James Monroe is going to send Jackson, who is by this time a major general, to southern Georgia to fight against the Seminole and the Creek Indians. This becomes known as the First Seminole War. Well, these Creek Indians and these Seminole Indians had taken up arms against the U.S. government because the U.S. government had signed treaties with them. And to no surprise, the U.S. government had not honored their treaty. And so Monroe orders Jackson to prevent Florida from becoming an easy destination for escaped slaves. Because if you remember at this time, Florida belonged to the Spanish. And so many of these runaway slaves had taken refuge in Seminole villages. So Jackson leads raids against the Seminoles in Spanish-occupied Florida. And the United States wins this conflict, known as the First Seminole War, which results in Spain ceding Florida to the United States in 1819 in the Adams-Onís Treaty. Jackson then is going to serve as governor of the Florida Territory in 1821. In our last talk, in our last series, we talked about the election of 1824 and how Jackson dubs this election the corrupt bargain. And we'll revisit that idea here for just a minute. So Jackson ran for president in 1824, and by that time the Democratic Republican Party had established this one-party leadership of the federal government. Remember, the Federalist Party had pretty much died out. So, far from unified, the party is going to divide into 4 competing factions. And so we have 4 candidates vying for the presidency. These candidates are Jackson from Tennessee, John Quincy Adams from Massachusetts, William Crawford from Georgia, and Henry Clay from Kentucky. Each candidate is going to receive majority support in particular areas of the country, which I think, again, illustrates how our country was becoming divided into different sections of the United States rather than the United States as a whole. So the Northeast favored John Quincy Adams. The South preferred Andrew Jackson. Residents of the mid-Atlantic states are also going to vote for Jackson, as did many of the Westerners. And at this time, Western is going to be Illinois, Indiana. Missouri, Kentucky, and Ohio are going to vote for Henry Clay, while Georgia and Virginia are going to vote for William Crawford. No candidate is going to fare much better or worse than the others in the overall election, and the national results are going to be inconclusive. So according to the Constitution, then it's going to go to the House. Well, Jackson receives most electoral and popular votes, but he didn't win the necessary majority of votes, so he doesn't have over 50%. The House of Representatives is going to have to decide this election's outcome. Well, we know that the 12th Amendment of the Constitution required the House to consider only the top 3 in electoral votes. So this immediately is going to push Henry Clay out of the running because he was number 4. And as Speaker of the House, he's going to support John Quincy Adams over Andrew Jackson because he strongly dislikes Jackson. The House is going to elect Adams, who received support of 13 states as opposed for 7 states supporting Jackson and 4 for Crawford. This election is going to mark the first time in which the candidate who received the most electoral votes did not win the presidency. And we know that that's happened several more times in history since then, but this was the first time in 1824. The Constitution requires the winning candidate to receive a majority of electoral votes, and that doesn't happen. And although popular votes were not officially counted nationwide back then, Jackson probably won the popular vote as well. So shortly after the House vote, a Philadelphia newspaper is going to publish a statement allegedly written by a member of Congress who claims that Clay supported Adams in return for Adams' guarantee to appoint Clay as his Secretary of State. So Jackson accuses them that John Quincy Adams met with Henry Clay and said, Henry Clay, if you'll throw all your support in Congress towards me so I can win the presidency, then I will in turn appoint you as one of my cabinet positions. Well, after Adams becomes president, he did appoint Clay to this position. And so this prompts Jackson to accuse Clay and Adams of a corrupt bargain. And since the last 4 secretaries of state had become president, Adams appeared to be counting on Clay to be his successor in 1 or 2 terms, depending on if he was reelected. Most historians doubt whether Clay and Adams actually conspired in this manner, but it certainly appears so on the surface. So in the election of 1828, it's going to be Adams versus Jackson again. Now, John Quincy Adams is running for his second term in 1828. Remember, his father was John Adams, a 1-term president, and they were very, very similar. Not really good socially, high intellect, but it didn't really come across when you met them in person because their presence didn't carry that. So, once again, he's going to run against Andrew Jackson. Adams' vice president, John C. Calhoun, is going to campaign this time as Jackson's vice presidential running mate. Adams and his supporters, which are including his vice presidential candidate Richard Rush, become known as the National Republicans. Jackson and his supporters call themselves the Democratic Republicans, but eventually become known as the Democrats and then later the Jacksonian Democrats. There's no other major candidates that run in 1828. The 1828 campaign is going to show a large amount of contention and bitterness towards each other from the candidates. The Adams campaign, for example, is going to attack Jackson and his wife Rachel for having been married before she had officially divorced her previous husband. Adams' supporters also rallied against Jackson's Indian massacre and his reputation for engaging in duels. Jackson's campaign, for its part, accused Adams of spending public funds on gambling in the White House because Adams had purchased a pool table and a chessboard. Jackson is going to have a strong base of supporters, including ones he had gained since his previous presidential election. Newark politician Martin Van Buren is going to campaign in his favor. He also gained support from Southerners who favored states' rights. Jackson won 178 electoral votes to Adams' 83. Adams only won states in New England or Mid-Atlantic regions. Jackson's going to take office in 1829, the first president hailing from the area west of the Appalachians. His wife Rachel is going to die of a heart attack December 22nd, 1828, and Jackson is going to blame her death on the mudslinging that occurred against her during his campaign. This election in 1828 begins the Jacksonian Era of government in the United States. Most times, Jackson's political philosophy is referred to as Jacksonian Democracy, and his followers the Jacksonian Democrats. His ideas about how the federal government should operate and relate to the public are going to stem from Thomas Jefferson's philosophies and those of the Democratic Republican Party members who precede him. So Madison and Monroe. They also differ sharply from those of John Adams and the Federalists, and later the Whig Party. Jackson believed in a very strict interpretation of the Constitution, which granted states the power not explicitly outlined in the Constitution. However, this philosophy of his is going to become a source of tension during his administration, and Jackson is going to advocate for more expansive interpretation of the Constitution as time goes on, which again reminds us a lot of of Thomas Jefferson. Um, Jackson preferred a hands-off or a laissez-faire, as you will, approach to the economy. And to this end, he's going to oppose national banks, which again reminds us a lot of Thomas Jefferson. He's going to favor the patronage system by which elected officials appointed to office people who would help them get elected or who had done them special favors. So Jackson and his supporters believed in this patronage or spoils system would increase political participation on the part of regular people and would force the politicians who appointed these officials to be more accountable to their constituents. So he's doing it with a pure sense and a pure heart there. Jackson opposed long terms for elected and appointed officials and instead favored the regular rotation of individuals in government positions so that you didn't get someone who got in there and was so comfortable that they did whatever they wanted and they didn't think they could get voted out. The Jacksonian era coincides with a time of increasing westward expansion. And we're going to break this up into separate units for our purposes, but they are intertwined. Jackson and his supporters believe in this concept of manifest destiny, that the United States was destined to occupy the lands from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. And this philosophy required conquest over Native Americans who were already living there. Jackson therefore made Native American relocation a central part of his work as president, and he's going to be quite successful at this. And the election of 1824 had been the first election in which men without property could vote for president, and Jacksonians promoted this increased suffrage for white men and expanding white male suffrage substantially during Jackson's presidency. When you see this word suffrage, I need you to automatically think of the right to vote. When you see suffrage, it's not a misspelling of suffrage like pain and suffering, but the idea of suffrage, spelled like this, means the right to vote. So, in general, Jackson is going to consider and promote himself as president for the common man. And the definition of this term at this time included only white men, not Native Americans, African Americans, or women, because they are not yet afforded the right to vote. And we have a quote over here from Andrew Jackson: "As long as our government is administered for the good of the people and is regulated by their will, as long as it secures to use the rights of persons and of property, liberty of conscience and of the press will be worth defending." I want you to think about that quote, and I want you to tell me what you think that means. Okay, regulated by their will, and how do the people express what their will is? And let's talk about that when you come into class tomorrow.